I just feel like as women, we're just more tuned into our environment. And so we're always scanning, our bodies are always scanning the environment for safety. And our bodies are like, is it time to survive? Is it time to reproduce? Is it time to thrive? And we're super, super tuned into that. Women have, more hormone receptors in our bodies. And I just kind of think about it. We just have like these antennas that are very tuned into stress signals and danger signals in our environment. And so we have to be extra mindful of the messages that we send our bodies to make sure that we're staying in that thriving mode and not picking up too many of the signals that are going to send us into that survival mode.
Welcome to the Woman's Doctor podcast, helping empower women to embrace their body and soul's full potential. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Cates, and after 22 years of working with patients, I found the answers to our health struggles are much deeper than most people realize. To help explore this, I'm interviewing colleagues and other wellness experts to get to the root cause so women can realize their true beauty and be informed decision makers for themselves and their loved ones. If you feel tired and stressed, you will definitely want to listen to today's episode. We're talking about our adrenals. Adrenal dysfunction is much more common than most people realize, but most doctors do not treat this issue. Adrenal fatigue is not considered a disease, but if our adrenal glands are not functioning well, then we will not only struggle with our energy and focus, but also our sleep and weight. My guest today is Dr. Isabella Wentz, who is an innovative and solution-focused clinical pharmacist, also trained in functional medicine. After being diagnosed with Hoshimoto's thyroiditis in 2009, Dr. Wentz was surprised at the lack of knowledge about lifestyle interventions for Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, so she went on to publish multiple New York Times bestselling books on these topics. And now she has a new book, Adrenal Transformation Protocol, a 4-week plan to release stress symptoms and go from surviving to thriving. In today's interview, we discuss how to know if you have adrenal issues and what these triggers may be, why women tend to have these more than men, and how to balance your stress response and build resilience to support your adrenals. This and much more on today's episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast. Dr. Wentz, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. So for those people who are not familiar with you, you are known often as the thyroid pharmacist. So tell us first about thyroid and get us up to speed on why you got that title. Have you always been interested in thyroid?
So in full disclosure, I wasn't always interested in the thyroid, not even during pharmacy school when I was learning about the thyroid. It really took me getting a diagnosis of Hashimoto's after 10 years of some confusing and somewhat debilitating symptoms, including chronic fatigue. And then getting on thyroid medications and not getting better for me to really get passionate about the subject. And I became a Hashimoto's / thyroid expert / human guinea pig because I just was trying to feel better. Like I was just trying to feel like a normal human. And so I dove into the world of research, functional medicine, integrative medicine, natural medicine in an effort to heal myself.
Yeah, great. And you've helped so many people with thyroid. I have lots of patients who've read your books and friends that have mentioned you, and I've had you on the Spa Doctor podcast and things. And it's great now that you have a new book that's coming out, but you've switched gears a little bit. It may seem to some people to be a different kind of topic, but you and I know there's definitely a connection. So your new book is Adrenal Transformation Protocol. So adrenals. How are adrenals and thyroid connected? What made you decide to do this book, to go in this direction?
So I've worked with thousands of people over the last decade with thyroid issues, and I'll tell you that 90% of them have some degree of adrenal dysfunction. And for people who are already taking thyroid medications and they're like, my hormones are balanced, but why do I still feel tired? Why do I have brain fog? Why am I gaining weight? Why am I having unrefreshed sleep and anxiety and mood issues and all these symptoms? Like, what is going on with me? Most of the time, it's the adrenals. It's the adrenals that need that extra support, because getting on thyroid hormone can actually unmask an underlying adrenal issue. When we get on thyroid hormone, this normalizes our cortisol clearance. And so a lot of times I'll see people who started off getting a thyroid diagnosis. And once we kind of peel back the layers, we really need to focus on the health of their adrenals. And then I've also had clients who've come to me that said, I can't get a diagnosis of thyroid. Like, I've gotten the antibody tests, I've gotten the TSH test, I've even done an ultrasound, and my doctors say I don't have a thyroid issue, but yet I have this brain fog, fatigue, all of the symptoms, right? What's going on? And in that case, a lot of times what's happening is when somebody gets into that dysfunctional stress state, when they've been under chronic stress for a long time, known as adrenal dysfunction, they'll actually produce more of a type of thyroid hormone known as reverse T3 that blocks thyroid hormone receptors. And they end up have symptomatic for thyroid issues just because of that impaired stress response, even though their thyroid function is quote unquote normal without even having any kind of thyroid condition on board. So I really wanted to kind of bring it all together and bring it front and centered that the adrenals need support when you have a thyroid issue, when you have these symptoms. You do need to support your adrenals. And I've also come up with a kind of a new approach to it, a new protocol when I became a new mom and I couldn't utilize some of the traditional integrative medicine protocols for healing adrenals.
Okay, amazing. So tell us more about adrenal dysfunction for people who don't know a lot about adrenal dysfunction. How would they know if they had it?
It's not a disease per se, right? So it's not like you'll go to your endocrinologist and they'll say you have adrenal dysfunction or adrenal fatigue. This is something that most integrative doctors and functional medicine, naturopathic doctors will test for with an adrenal saliva test or with a Dutch test. And you can also see this in your symptoms. So what adrenal dysfunction is, it's essentially a cluster of symptoms when there's a disconnect between our hypothalamus and our pituitary and our production of stress hormones in the body. It's what happens, essentially, very simple terms, when the body's been overwhelmed by stress for too long. And we get into this pattern where we shift from thriving into more of a survival mechanism. And so our body's breaking itself down rather than repairing itself and building itself back up. Typically, the symptoms are going to be brain fog, trouble waking up in the morning, fatigue, especially morning fatigue. People might have irritability, anxiety, mood swings, trouble falling asleep, waking up throughout the night, unrefreshed sleep. They might have salt and sugar cravings. They might be dependent on that morning caffeine to get going. They might be dependent on drinking wine in the evenings to help them wind down. They're going to be sensitive to bright lights. They're going to be feeling overwhelmed and irritable, wired, but tired. And this is kind of the cluster of symptoms when you're just like, this doesn't feel so good, right? I just don't feel good. And people may have a diagnosis like an autoimmune condition with this or diabetes or another thing, or they may have no diagnosis, but it is something that is essentially how the body responds when it's been stuck in that stress state for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. And with cortisol, I know a lot of people think that cortisol is like a bad thing, actually. They think, oh, I've got too much cortisol. And it's become a thing I see, online a lot. And social media is like, oh, to have too much cortisol. Can you talk a bit about cortisol and the Goldilocks sweet spot for cortisol?
And I know as a doctor, this, we require cortisol for life, right? And we need to have it on board to manage our inflammation, to support our immune system, to help produce healthy levels of energy throughout the day. And the thing is, it needs to be in balance, right? So when we have too much cortisol, that can be problematic. When we don't have enough of it, that could be problematic. And cortisol the release of it should follow a circadian pattern so that in the morning we get more of it. So we can wake up and be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and get going and do all kinds of great things and have, that energy, like without necessarily even relying on caffeine, where our brain's working, we're ready to get going. And then as the day goes on, we should gradually see a reduction in that cortisol throughout the day so that in the evening, we're kind of like, kind of tired, I'm ready to wind down. And then we sleep, we have refreshing sleep. The problem becomes when that circadian release of cortisol is dysfunctional. So a person might have too much cortisol all day and even in the evenings and at nighttime, and they're like really irritated person. They might be angry. They might be hopping out of bed with a million things to do. They can't fall asleep. They're thinking about all the things they need to do throughout the day. Everybody is annoying to them. The world is just moving too slow, right? And that's kind of the initial stress response. As time goes on, people might get on what's called a cortisol roller coaster, where some of the daily cortisols will drop. So they might wake up tired, then have a burst of energy at noon, then they'll have a 3 p.m. crash when they feel irritable and hangry, and anxious. And then in the evening, their cortisol will spike up again, and they'll be like, I was so tired a few hours ago, and now I'm like, I'm feeling off and I can't sleep. And then as that time goes on, they'll wake up tired in the morning and they'll have a flipped cortisol curve, where in the evenings, they'll be tired all throughout the day, but in the evening, they'll get that second wind of energy. And these are kind of like the night owl people that are like, but I feel normal in the evenings, right? And then finally, if that goes on long enough, and it could be in some people, it could be weeks, and some people, it could be years, that this process of being stuck in that survival mode where this will progress, they'll end up with what I call flatlined adrenal curves, where they'll have low cortisol in the morning and that'll barely move all throughout the day. And they'll be tired in the afternoon, tired in the evening, tired at night. They'll sleep a lot, but they still wake up unrefreshed. And it's like kind of the same pattern over and over again. And typically this is what I actually see in people with autoimmunity, chronic fatigue, Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism.
Right, right. And you say adrenal dysfunction. A lot of people use the phrase adrenal fatigue. And I like that you used adrenal dysfunction, because how you described it, it's not like your adrenals are tired. I mean, they kind of are, but they kind of go through ups and downs. They don't just get low. Right. And so I know that in your book, you talk about how conventional doctors don't think that there's such a thing as adrenal fatigue. So can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I've had a lot of people that I've tried to educate over the years and talk about adrenal fatigue, and they will, maybe read some of what I said or listen to a snippet, and they'll go to their doctors, be like, can you test my adrenals? And the doctors will test them for Addison's disease, which is a very rare and life-threatening condition where 90% of your adrenal glands are going to be damaged by an immune process. And then you can't make your own steroids or mineralocorticoids. And then you have to get on replacement. This is very rare. And so that's kind of what most physicians will test for, that are not, integrative trained. And they'll say, well, you don't have adrenal issues, right? You don't have Addison's. And so this is kind of like the tricky part, where when the doctor that first coined the term adrenal fatigue, when he noticed this cluster of symptoms, he initially said, okay, he kind of had a theory about what causes them. And his theory was that it was kind of like a mild version of Addison's, so that the adrenals were not capable of producing these hormones at the right times because, maybe they were damaged or suppressed for some reason. And now we kind of understand the mechanism of action a little bit more clearly. And we know that the adrenals in this dysfunctional state, which is, again, not a disease, it's kind of like what your body does when it's stressed, they're still capable of producing the hormones and steroids at the right amounts, at the right times of day, but they're not doing it because there's a communication breakdown between the brain and the adrenal glands. So there's a lot of like terminology things. And I feel like spending so much time talking about the terminology because people will say adrenal fatigue doesn't exist. But I'm like, yeah, it does. And you could call it burnout. You could call it adrenal fatigue. You could call it adrenal dysfunction. It is a real thing. It is what happens. There are so many studies supporting hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction if you look them up online. So it's kind of I guess, nomenclature challenge, right?
Right. Right. So now that we've established that it is a real thing, how do you talk about? I mean, this is not a small book. This is a pretty thick book. So how do you recommend addressing adrenal dysfunction?
Sure. So the first part of the book, it's focused on how to tune into your body and assess yourself. So I know a lot of times I would recommend for people to seek out integrative doctors to help them with testing their adrenals, and that's not always available to everybody. And so I do go through like assessments so people can figure out if this is relevant for them, right? Pretty much I know if you have that brain fog, fatigue, trouble sleeping, and you're kind of wired but tired, overwhelmed, there's a good chance you're in that state. It's pretty common to be in that state. So that's the first part of the book that goes over to that. The second part of the book is a 4-week protocol where I really focus on giving you tools to rewire your stress response to shift you from that survival mode into thriving mode. And we really focus on sending safety signals through like nutrition, through hydration, through connecting you with a circadian rhythm, through incorporating pleasurable activities to your life so you can revitalize your energy levels, and then through building resilience. So that's kind of a 4-week plan that I've tested out with over 3,500 people that has these fabulous results of 92% of people improve their brain fog, and more than 80% will have improvements in sleep issues and fatigue and, you know, all of these frustrating symptoms, right? And then the last part of the book goes over, okay, if you have special circumstances, let's say you're in perimenopause, is there anything else that you may wish to add on after you complete this 4-week protocol? If you are somebody that is a new mom or a tired mommy, is there anything else you can do to make up for the sleep that you're not getting? If you're, you know, if you're still struggling with your libido, what else can we do there after the 4-week protocol to kind of dial things in a little bit further? But really the big focus is like that 4-week plan that's really straightforward. And I've tried to make it as easy to do for people as possible. So I don't ask people to like quit coffee and for it to sleep 12 hours a night or take hormones, which, you know, these are great strategies, but they're not necessarily accessible to everybody at every point in their lives, right?
Right. Okay. So what are some of the lifestyle choices that make a big difference?
One of the big ones is eating foods that are nutrient rich, and we're focusing on foods that are lots of protein, lots of good fats, foods that are not inflammatory to you. So we're getting off of gluten, dairy, and soy. These are common sources of inflammation to people that can send some of those stress signals. We're making sure you're getting plenty of protein and plenty of fat, lowering your carb intake so that you get off of this blood sugar roller coaster. Sometimes for some people, just the blood sugar swings can really stress their adrenals and can kind of put them into that survival mode. So just doing that nutritional safety signal can shift a lot of symptoms right away. So people will say like, I thought I had anxiety. Turns out I just had blood sugar issues, right? I just needed more fat and protein, and that's what I really needed to do. So that's a big part of it. The other part is supporting the health of the mitochondria. A lot of times people have low levels of energy production because they're in that survival mode and they're stressed out. And our mitochondria are very tuned into our stress as well, very tuned into the toxic exposures we have. And so I focus a lot on supporting mitochondrial health. We utilize carnitine, we utilize D-ribose, we utilize exposure to lights in the morning to help build some of the mitochondria, and more of the high-fat diet to support mitochondrial health. And this restores, for people with brain fog, this is a really, really big game changer where I utilize a blend like a acetyl L-carnitine combined with, which supports brain health, combined with L-carnitine, which supports muscle health. And so people will see like, I feel stronger, my fatigue has improved, and my brain function has gotten so much better. So I do use a lot of targeted nutrients, very small amount of them, actually just 6 supplements throughout the program to kind of restore that thriving state in a really quick fashion.
Okay. And so that's food. What about other lifestyle components, other things that food and nutrients? But what other things do you recommend?
A big part of what I will recommend is for people to really focus on pleasurable activities and finding that joy in life. What I found is a lot of times people, because it's something that it has healing benefits when you experience pleasure and you experience joy and oxytocin. all of these beautiful hormones, they flood our system into more of a healing and thriving state.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at, because you work a lot with people with autoimmune disease because of the thyroid um, autoimmune disease that you work with, do you talk much about that in this book?
Um, do I talk about how to help
Addressing
people with thyroid
autoimmune.
issues? What's
Mhm.
that?
With autoimmune.
Yeah. So I do have sections throughout the book that focus, and everything that is in there has been tested on people with Hashimoto's and autoimmune issues and all of the things. The program has launched 7 times. And so the first few times it was people with Hashimoto's that were joining. And then subsequent times they were like, I told my friend about this, but she doesn't have Hashimoto's. Can she join? And the program kind of spread by word of mouth that it was really helpful for anybody with these stress related issues. And so we've had people with all kinds of health conditions, diagnoses, people without diagnoses joining the program with phenomenal results as well. But I do talk about some of the foundational things in there really are helpful for people with autoimmune thyroid issues. For example, myo-inositol can help normalize blood sugar levels. It can help people sleep, relieve anxiety. It can also help normalize TSH levels. And sometimes by itself or even combined with selenium can get a person with Hashimoto's into remission, just that intervention alone of utilizing that. So there's a lot of focus on like everything that is in that book is going to be helpful for a person with Hashimoto's, but also anybody with autoimmunity as well, and anybody with adrenal dysfunction.
Yeah. Why do you think women have more issues with thyroid and adrenals than men? Or do you think that is the case?
Definitely is the case. The research does support for every woman that's diagnosed with a thyroid issue, there's going to be, or for every man, there's going to be, 5 to 7 women diagnosed with the thyroid issue. And then we know with autoimmunity, that's going to be more common. HPA axis dysfunction, that's going to be more common in women. I just feel like as women, we're just more tuned into our environment. And so we're always scanning, our bodies are always scanning at the environment for safety. And our bodies are like, is it time to survive? Is it time to reproduce? Is it time to thrive? And we're super, super tuned into that. Women have, more hormone receptors in our bodies. And I just kind of think about it. We just have more, like these antennas that are very tuned into stress signals and danger signals in our environment. And so we have to be extra mindful of the messages that we send our bodies to make sure that we're staying in that thriving mode and not picking up too many of the signals that are going to send us into that survival mode.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you talked about other hormones too, because they, they're all interrelated.
Mhm.
And with all of the hormonal changes we have throughout a month, throughout our lives, that can definitely impact our adrenals as well as our thyroid, right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, there's big changes that happen in perimenopause and pregnancy, puberty. One of the key things too, when going through perimenopause and menopause, the adrenals actually take over some of the hormone production once the ovaries stop. And so supporting your adrenal function during perimenopause and menopause is like even more becomes very, very relevant very quickly, right? If you haven't been supporting your adrenals throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about toxins in the environment, endocrine disrupting chemicals? Do you talk much about that in your book and you use that in your protocols?
I focus a lot on, basically really anything that is in our environment that is perceived as stress. And this could be a toxin, environmental toxin. It could be a mycotoxin. It could be your gut producing too much ammonia. All of these things can really put us into that fight or flight state, into that, like, this is a source of stress in your body. And so to like, no matter, I kind of like, I'm stumbling here on words, but what I've found over the years is just about everybody is going to need to survive. Okay, hold on a second. Let me clear my throat. What I've found over the years is that no matter what kind of trigger you have, whether that's a toxin, whether that's a gut issue, whether that's a psychological trigger, past history of trauma, those things can all get you stuck in that survival mode. And there's a very predictable way of getting out of that survival mode into thriving. So I really focus on rebalancing your energy levels and your vitality levels first, to giving your body some of that fuel to take care of itself and have the energy. And then I talk about, in the advanced section of the book, I talk about various triggers and various tests that people can utilize to figure out if they are exposed to toxins, and so on and so forth. One really powerful problematic toxin is mold toxicity and mycotoxins. And most people with mold toxicity will be in adrenal dysfunction, right? And so you will need to focus on getting the mold out of your system and perhaps out of your house. And also, you really need to rewire your stress response when you do that. If you've had a history of trauma, that can also shift you into that adrenal dysfunction. So chances are you're going to have to address the trauma, maybe do some work like EMDR, and you're also going to have to address your stress response and physiologically and emotionally. So there's the book really combines a lot of the physiological work and emotional work in the core protocols. And then in the advanced protocols, I talk about some of the triggers and toxins, because some people will say, there's adrenal fatigue doesn't exist. It's actually just mold toxicity. Or fatigue doesn't exist. It's actually this person has a parasite, or this person has this, or sleep apnea, or mitochondrial issues. And all of those things can actually be true, that a person with adrenal dysfunction may also have mold toxicity, or they may also have Lyme or something else. But at the end of the day, they still need to address that stress response. And a lot of times addressing their energy levels and their stress response is going to be helpful for overcoming the infection or the toxic exposure or the traumatic experience, right? It's a focus on building our resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a little bit about gut health. So tell us about, what is your approach on gut and the connection with your adrenals?
So some of the triggers that can put ourselves into that stress response include gut infections or gut inflammation. So if we're eating inflammatory foods, that can be very problematic and cause intestinal permeability, leaky gut. Part of the program is we're lowering our intake of inflammatory foods. And then what happens when somebody is under a lot of stress, their levels of secretory IgA get reduced. And what this means is this is something that protects our gut lining from foreign invaders. So when this is low, we're more likely to go to a sushi restaurant and everybody comes out just fine from the food that they eat, but we're the ones that get sick, get food poisoning, or perhaps catch a parasite, or we have various infections in our gut that might be playing well with the other microbes in our gut and be kept in check. But when that secretory IgA is low, all of these potentially pathogenic microbes can take over. And so part of the protocol is I utilize Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a beneficial yeast, and that raises the secretory IgA levels in the gut so that your gut becomes more resilient. So you're overcoming these infections naturally. You're not going to be as reactive to various foods. You don't have to worry so much about going out to eat and catching something, right? So I do utilize that. And then another part of what I see in people with thyroid issues is they tend to be constipated. And when we are constipated for prolonged periods of time, this can cause an increase in ammonia production. Ammonia is a really big mitochondrial toxin, and it's something that can also cause a lot of brain fog. And so I focus on making sure we typically use magnesium and a magnesium citrate form if you're constipated. This is great for restoring your stress response, getting rid of, anxiety, getting you to sleep better, getting rid of those joint pains and cramps. And also the citrate form can help with promoting bowel movements. And so that can help to clear out the ammonia out of the body, as well as the carnitine and S. boulardii that I talk about. And typically people will say, with the ammonia symptoms, it's like brain fog and frequent night waking. Some muscle weakness are some of the more common symptoms, and that is associated with the constipation. So I have just a core list of supplements, but they all have like 5 to 7 different mechanisms of action so that they help the body clear out toxins, right? So if we're pooping every day, we're going to be clearing out toxins that way. If we're Magnesium also supports so many other pathways, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Amazing. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Lots of great information. And I mean, I really find that adrenal issues are so common, and that especially when we get to a certain age. And like you said, this is a time for women when we really need our adrenals working because they're producing our hormones that our ovaries are no longer producing. So it's so important to address our adrenals. Will you tell everyone where they can learn more about you and get your book?
Absolutely. So my website is thyroidpharmacist.com. I'm on Instagram under Isabella Wentz PharmD, and on Facebook at Thyroid Pharmacist Dr. Isabella Wentz. And you can get my book on Amazon and Barnes and Noble or wherever fine books are sold. It's called the Adrenal Transformation Protocol.
Great. Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you so much, Trevor. It's been such a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast, be sure to share it with the women in your life and rate and review the show. And to learn all about balancing your hormones, join us for the Hormones, Health, and Harmony 9-part documentary series at hormoneseries.com.